What if I told you that losing everything doesn't always happen in one moment? Sometimes it happens slowly, piece by piece, until one day you look around and realize there's nothing left to hold on to. Nothing left that feels like yours, and maybe you felt that too, that quiet collapse where things don't shatter all at once. They just disappear over time, and that's exactly how it happened to me, not with one big event. Not with one dramatic ending, but with small losses that kept adding up until they became something I couldn't ignore anymore. And at first, I told myself it was temporary, that things would settle, that I would find my way back to something familiar, something stable. But the truth is, some losses don't come with a return, they don't give you a path back. They just take and take until you're left standing in a version of your life that feels unrecognizable. And that's where I found myself, not in chaos, not in panic, but in something much quieter and heavier. Something that felt final in a way I hadn't expected, because when you lose things gradually, you don't notice the moment it becomes everything. You only notice it when it's already too late, and I remember that realization clearly. Not because of what was happening around me, but because of what wasn't, because suddenly there was nothing demanding my attention, nothing pulling me forward, nothing giving me a reason to keep moving the way I used to. And that silence, it's different. It's not peaceful. It's not calm. It's empty in a way that feels endless, and I didn't know what to do with that at first. Because when your life is built around things that suddenly disappear, you're left without structure, without direction, without anything to hold on to, and maybe you've been there. That place where even the smallest decisions feel heavy because there's no clear reason behind them anymore, and I tried to keep going at first. I tried to act like things were normal, like I could rebuild what had been lost, like I could create something new from what remained. But the truth is, there was less and less remaining each time I looked, and eventually I stopped trying. Not because I wanted to give up, but because I didn't know what I was holding on to anymore. And that's the part people don't talk about, not the loss itself, but what comes after it, that quiet period where everything feels uncertain, where you're not sure who you are without the things that used to define your life, where you're not sure what matters anymore because everything that mattered has already slipped away. And that uncertainty, it doesn't come with answers, it just stays. It lingers, it becomes part of how you think, part of how you move through each day. And over time, that uncertainty turned into something else, something heavier, something that felt like acceptance but without peace. Because I wasn't fighting it anymore, I wasn't trying to change it anymore. I had simply reached a point where I believed, this is what my life looks like now, and maybe you've had that thought before. That quiet acceptance that doesn't feel good, but feels easier than resisting something you can't control. And that's where I stayed, in that space where nothing changed because I stopped expecting it to. Where days passed without meaning because I stopped looking for it, where everything felt distant, even the things that were right in front of me, and the hardest part wasn't the loss itself anymore. It was the realization that I had become someone who no longer expected anything better, someone who had quietly accepted that this was the end of what my life could be, and that realization, it changes you. Because when you stop expecting, you stop noticing, you stop caring, you stop engaging with the world around you, and everything becomes background. Everything becomes something that exists without meaning, and that's how I moved through those days. Not in pain exactly, but in something that felt heavier than pain, something that didn't demand attention but also didn't go away, something that made everything feel distant, like I was watching my own life instead of living it. And I didn't question it anymore. I didn't ask why things had turned out this way. I didn't look for answers, because questions require hope, and hope was something I had quietly let go of without even realizing it. And then something shifted, not in a way I expected, not in a way I noticed immediately, but in a way that felt different enough to break through the silence I had been living in. Because sometimes, when everything feels like it's over, something small happens that doesn't fit into that belief, something that doesn't belong to the life you've accepted, and at first you try to ignore it, you tell yourself it doesn't matter. That it's just a moment, just something passing through, but even as you dismiss it, it stays, it lingers, it makes you aware of something you hadn't felt in a long time, and that's exactly what happened, because in the middle of everything feeling empty, in the middle of everything feeling finished, there was a moment, small, almost unnoticeable, but different enough to make me pause, and that pause, it mattered more than anything else. Because it was the first time in a long time that something didn't feel the same, the first time something broke through the certainty I had built around my life, and I didn't understand it at first, I didn't know what it meant. But I knew one thing clearly, it didn't belong to the life I thought was over, And that realization, it unsettled me more than anything else because if something didn't belong, then maybe everything wasn't as finished as I believed. And that thought alone, it was enough to change everything, because the moment you start questioning the end, you open the door to something else. And standing there, in that quiet shift I couldn't fully explain, one question formed in my mind that I couldn't ignore anymore. What if losing everything wasn't actually the end? What if I told you that the moment you start questioning whether it's really over is the moment something inside you begins to wake up again, even if you don't want it to, even if you're not ready for it, because after that small shift, after that quiet moment that didn't fit into the life I had accepted, I couldn't go back to the same kind of emptiness completely. Something had already changed, something small but enough to disturb the stillness I had grown used to. And maybe you felt that too, that subtle crack in the silence where something new tries to enter. And at first, you resist it, because when you've already accepted that nothing will change, any sign that it might feels uncomfortable, almost wrong. Like it doesn't belong, and that's exactly how it felt, because I wasn't ready to believe that anything could be different. I had spent too long convincing myself that this was the end, that there was nothing left to expect. And suddenly, there was this small awareness that maybe that wasn't entirely true, and I didn't know what to do with that. Because hope, even in the smallest form, can feel heavier than emptiness when you're not used to it anymore. Because emptiness doesn't ask anything from you, but hope does. It asks you to pay attention, to stay open, to consider possibilities you had already closed. And I wasn't sure I wanted that. I wasn't sure I could handle that. And so I tried to ignore it. I tried to return to the routine I had built, the quiet, predictable way of moving through each day without expecting anything, without noticing anything, without allowing anything to matter too much. But the truth is, once something shifts inside you, even slightly, it doesn't fully go back, because now there was a part of me that was aware of the difference between how things felt before and how they felt now. And that awareness, it changed everything in a subtle but undeniable way, because even though my life looked exactly the same on the outside, it didn't feel exactly the same on the inside anymore, because now I was noticing things again. Not everything, not all at once, but small details, small moments that stood out just enough to make me pause, and that pause, it became more frequent, more noticeable. Like something inside me was slowly coming back to life without asking for permission, and as that awareness grew, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. I wasn't as disconnected as I thought I was. Because if I were, I wouldn't be noticing anything at all. I wouldn't be feeling that difference. I wouldn't be aware of something changing. And that realization, it forced me to confront something I hadn't wanted to admit. Maybe I hadn't completely given up. Maybe there was still a part of me that was paying attention, that was waiting, even if I didn't realize it. And that thought alone, it changed how I experienced everything that followed, because now I wasn't just moving through my days, I was aware of them again, aware of how they felt, aware of how certain moments stood out. Aware of how something small could shift my entire perspective even if nothing else had changed. And that awareness, it didn't feel comfortable at first. It felt unfamiliar, like stepping into something I didn't fully understand. Because when you've lived in emptiness for so long, feeling anything at all feels overwhelming in a quiet way. And I found myself caught in that feeling, not knowing whether to embrace it or push it away. Because both options carried something I wasn't ready for, embracing it meant opening myself to something new, something uncertain. Something that could change everything, and pushing it away meant going back to a life that no longer felt exactly the same. And that's when I realized something important. There was no going back completely. Because the moment I had questioned whether it was really over, I had already stepped out of that certainty. And that's not something you can undo easily, because once doubt enters a belief, it changes it forever. And now there was doubt in the idea that my life was finished, doubt in the idea that nothing would ever change again, and that doubt, it didn't give me answers, but it gave me something else, curiosity, and curiosity is powerful. Because it pulls you forward even when you're not ready to move, it makes you look again, it makes you pay attention, it makes you wonder what you might have missed, and that's exactly what it did. Because now I wasn't just noticing small moments, I was starting to wonder about them, starting to question why they felt different, why they stood out, why they stayed with me longer than anything else had in a long time. And as those questions began to build, as that curiosity became harder to ignore, I realized something that changed everything once again. Something was coming into my life that didn't belong to the version of it I had accepted. Something I hadn't planned, something I hadn't expected, something that was beginning to take shape without me even realizing it, and that realization, it was both unsettling and impossible to ignore. Because if something new was beginning, then everything I believed about my life being over might not be true anymore, and standing there, caught between what I had accepted and what I was now starting to question. One thought became impossible to ignore, stronger than anything else. If this isn't the end, then what is it? What if I told you that the moment you start asking, "What is this?" is the moment it stops being random and starts becoming real? Because up until then, everything had been quiet, uncertain. Something I could still dismiss if I tried hard enough, something I could still explain away as just a passing shift in my thoughts. But the truth is, curiosity doesn't stay small, it grows, it pulls you closer. It makes you pay attention in a way you can't ignore forever. And maybe you felt that too, that moment where something that once felt insignificant suddenly becomes the center of your awareness, not because it changed, but because you did. And that's exactly what was happening to me, because now I wasn't just noticing the difference. I was drawn to it, drawn to understanding it, drawn to something I couldn't fully explain yet, and that pull, it didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel overwhelming, it felt quiet but persistent, like something gently guiding my attention in a direction I hadn't chosen. And that's when it happened, not in a way I expected, not in a way that stood out to anyone else, but in a way that felt unmistakable to me, because for the first time, I noticed him clearly, not as part of the background, not as just another person moving through the same space as me, but as someone who felt different in a way I couldn't immediately define. And maybe you've experienced that too, that moment where someone stands out without doing anything extraordinary, where their presence alone feels distinct. And that's exactly what this was, nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a presence that didn't blend into everything else the way everyone else did. And I remember that moment clearly, not because of what he did, but because of what I felt. Because for the first time in a long time, something caught my attention without effort, without force, without me trying to make it matter, and that alone was enough to make me pause. Because when you've spent so long feeling nothing, even the smallest shift feels significant, and I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was just my mind reacting to something new. Something unfamiliar in an otherwise predictable environment, but even as I told myself that, I found myself noticing him again, not intentionally, not consciously, but in the way your attention naturally returns to something that feels different, and that difference, it wasn't just in him, it was in how I experienced his presence, because suddenly the space around me didn't feel as empty. The silence didn't feel as heavy, the routine didn't feel as lifeless, and that shift, it mattered more than I wanted to admit, because it meant something inside me had already begun to change, something I hadn't planned. Something I hadn't prepared for, something that was unfolding whether I fully understood it or not. And as that awareness deepened, as I allowed myself to notice without immediately pushing it away, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. I was becoming aware of him, not just as someone who existed in the same space, but as someone who mattered in that space. Even if I didn't know why yet, and that realization, it's powerful, because the moment someone starts to matter, even slightly, everything changes, because now you're not just observing, you're feeling something. Even if you can't define it yet, and that's exactly what was happening, because now I wasn't just aware of his presence, I was aware of how it affected me, how it shifted something inside me that had been still for a long time, how it made me feel present in a way I hadn't felt in years. And that presence, it's difficult to ignore because it brings you back into your own life. It makes you realize that you're not as disconnected as you thought you were. And that realization, it stayed with me, growing quietly in the background of everything else, because now it wasn't just about him. It was about what his presence was doing to me, how it was changing the way I experienced everything around me. And that's when something even more unexpected happened, something that took everything from quiet awareness into something undeniable, because until that point, everything had existed at a distance. Everything had been something I could observe without being part of it. But then, that distance disappeared, not intentionally, not planned, just naturally. Like something that had been building quietly finally reached a point where it couldn't stay distant anymore, and suddenly, he wasn't just someone I noticed across the room, he was right there. Close enough that ignoring it wasn't an option anymore, close enough that the moment demanded awareness in a way I couldn't avoid, and that shift, it was immediate. Because when something moves from distance to presence, it becomes real in a way it wasn't before, and I could feel that reality instantly, not because of anything dramatic that happened, not because of anything he said, but because of how everything inside me responded to that moment, how my awareness sharpened, how everything else seemed to fade just slightly. How that simple proximity carried more weight than anything else I had experienced in a long time. And maybe you felt that too, that moment where something simple becomes significant because of how present you are in it. And that's exactly what this was, a simple moment that didn't feel simple at all. And as it passed, as everything returned to the same routine on the surface, I knew one thing clearly: it didn't feel the same anymore. Because now there was something real where there had only been emptiness before, something present where there had only been silence, and that difference, it wasn't going away. Because once something becomes real, it doesn't disappear just because you want it to, and standing there, aware of something I hadn't planned, something I hadn't expected, something I wasn't even sure I was ready for. I couldn't stop one thought from forming, stronger than anything before it. Why did the stranger feel different from everyone else? What if I told you that the moment something starts to feel different is the moment it begins to change you? Because after that first real awareness where he stopped being just another person in the background and became someone I couldn't ignore, I couldn't return to the same emptiness completely. Something inside me had already shifted. And maybe you felt that too, that quiet change that happens without permission, where nothing on the outside looks different, but everything inside you does, and that's exactly where I found myself, still in the same place. Still surrounded by the same routine, the same silence, the same life I had accepted as finished. But now there was something else there too, something subtle but impossible to ignore. Something that didn't belong to the version of my life I thought I was living, and the more I became aware of it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about noticing him anymore. It was about how I was starting to feel because of him, and that realization, it carried a kind of weight I hadn't felt in a long time. Because when you've spent so long feeling nothing, even the smallest emotion feels amplified, it feels unfamiliar, it feels like something you're not sure how to handle, and that's exactly how it felt. Because now I wasn't just aware of his presence, I was aware of how that presence affected me, how it shifted something inside me that had been still for so long, how it made the silence feel less empty, how it made the routine feel less meaningless, and that difference, it mattered more than I wanted to admit, because it meant something inside me had already begun to come back to life, something I had buried without even realizing it, something I had convinced myself I didn't need anymore, and that's what made it so unsettling, because if something inside me was waking up again, then everything I believed about my life being over might not be true. And that thought alone, it changed how I experienced everything that followed, because now I wasn't just moving through my days, I was aware of them again, aware of when certain moments stood out, aware of when something felt different, aware of when he was there and when he wasn't, and that awareness, it's powerful because it creates contrast. It shows you the difference between what your life was and what it's starting to become, and I could feel that contrast clearly now. Because when he was there, even in the simplest way, everything felt slightly more present, slightly more real, like something had shifted just enough to make everything else feel less distant. And when he wasn't, I noticed that too. I noticed the return of that quiet emptiness, but now it felt different. Now it felt like something was missing instead of something that had always been there. And that realization, it hit me harder than anything else so far. Because it showed me exactly how much had already changed, how something small had already taken space in my life without me fully realizing it. And that's when I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit before. This wasn't just a passing moment. This wasn't just something temporary. This was becoming something real, something that had already started to shape how I felt, how I thought, how I experienced everything around me. And that kind of realization, it's not easy to accept because it comes with something else too, risk. Because when something becomes real, it also becomes something you can lose. And that's something I hadn't had to think about for a long time, because when you feel nothing, there's nothing to lose, there's nothing to protect, there's nothing that can change your emotional state in a way that matters. But now, that was different. Now there was something that mattered, something that had the potential to affect me in ways I wasn't used to anymore. And that awareness, it brought with it a kind of hesitation, not because I wanted it to stop, but because I understood what it could mean if it continued. Because when something begins to matter again, it opens the door to everything that comes with it: the possibility, the uncertainty, the vulnerability, and standing there in that growing awareness, I found myself asking a question I hadn't asked in years, a question that carried more weight than anything else at that moment. What if this changes everything? And that question, it didn't feel like fear exactly. It felt like understanding, because I knew now that this wasn't something small anymore. This wasn't something I could dismiss or ignore. This was something that had already begun to reshape my life in ways I hadn't planned, and that realization, it left me standing between two versions of myself. The one who had accepted that everything was over, and the one who was starting to feel something again, and that space between those two, it's where everything changes because you can't stay in it forever. You have to move forward in one direction or the other, and as I stood there, aware of how much had already shifted, aware of how much this had already affected me, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else so far. I didn't want to go back to the way things were, and that realization alone, it changed everything. Because the moment you don't want to go back is the moment you've already started moving forward, and with that thought settling deeper inside me, one question became impossible to ignore. If this is already changing me, then what happens if I let it? What if I told you that the moment you start wondering what will happen if you let something grow is the moment it's already too late to stop it, because by the time that thought had fully settled in my mind, what happens if I let this continue? I wasn't standing at the edge anymore. I was already inside it, already feeling it, already living in a version of my life that didn't match the one I had accepted for so long. And maybe you felt that too. That realization that something has quietly taken root inside you before you even had the chance to question it. Because that's exactly what this was, something that had moved beyond awareness, beyond curiosity, beyond simple moments, into something that had begun to matter in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. And the more I became aware of that, the more I realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what was happening inside me, how something I thought was gone had started to come back, how a part of me I had stopped listening to was now impossible to silence. And that part, it was asking for something, not clearly, not directly, but in a way that felt undeniable. Like it was pulling me forward into something I didn't fully understand yet. And that pull, it didn't feel forced. It didn't feel overwhelming. It felt natural, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to exist again. And now that it had, it wasn't going to disappear easily. And as I stood there, aware of that shift, aware of how much had already changed without me even realizing it, I began to notice something else. Something that made everything feel even more real than before, because it wasn't just about how I felt when he was there. It was about how I felt when he wasn't, because now the absence of those moments felt different. Now the silence returned in a way that didn't feel the same as before. It didn't feel complete. It felt like something was missing, like there was a space that hadn't existed before, and that realization, it's powerful. Because it shows you exactly how much something matters, not just in its presence, but in its absence, and that's when it truly becomes undeniable, because you can ignore something when it's there, but you can't ignore the feeling when it's gone. And I could feel that clearly now, that contrast between what my life had been and what it was becoming, and that difference. It wasn't something I could push away anymore because it had already become part of how I experienced everything. Part of how I moved through each day, part of how I thought about what might happen next. And as that realization settled in, something else began to rise alongside it, something that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time: hope. Not strong, not overwhelming, but present in a way I hadn't felt in years. And that feeling, it's complicated because hope brings possibility, but it also brings risk. Because when you hope for something, you open yourself to the chance of losing it, and that's something I hadn't had to deal with for a long time, because when you expect nothing, you don't risk anything, you don't lose anything. You don't feel that kind of vulnerability, but now, that was different. Now there was something to lose, something that mattered enough to affect me, something that could change how I felt if it disappeared. And that awareness, it brought with it a kind of tension I couldn't ignore, because I found myself standing between two choices, even if I didn't say them out loud, even if I didn't fully admit them to myself yet. One side, the safety of going back, of closing this off before it became something bigger, of protecting myself from the uncertainty, from the risk, from the possibility of being hurt again, and the other side allowing it, letting it grow. Stepping into something I didn't fully understand, something that could change everything, and that choice, it's not easy, because both sides carry something, comfort on one side, possibility on the other, and standing there in that quiet conflict, I realized something that made everything clearer than it had been before. I had already chosen, not consciously, not deliberately, but through the way I had allowed myself to feel, through the way I hadn't pushed it away, through the way I had continued to notice, to care, to be aware of something I could have ignored. And that realization, it changed everything. Because it meant I wasn't deciding whether to start something. I was deciding whether to continue something that had already begun, and that's a very different place to be. Because continuing requires something more than curiosity. It requires acceptance, acceptance of the risk, acceptance of the uncertainty, acceptance of the fact that you don't know how it will end. And as I stood there, aware of that, aware of how far this had already gone, aware of how much it already mattered, I realized something that felt both simple and overwhelming at the same time. I didn't want to stop it, and that realization, it's the clearest one of all. Because the moment you know you don't want something to end is the moment you've already allowed it to become part of your life. And as that truth settled deeper inside me, one question became impossible to ignore. Stronger than anything else, if I've already come this far, then what happens if I go even further? What if I told you that the moment you realize you've already come too far to go back is the moment everything stops being a possibility and starts becoming a turning point? Because by then, by the time that thought had fully settled inside me, if I've already come this far, what happens if I go even further? I wasn't standing between two choices anymore. I was standing inside something that had already begun shaping me. Something that had already changed the way I felt, the way I thought, the way I experienced every single moment of my day, and maybe you felt that too. That quiet but undeniable realization that something has already taken hold of your life before you even had the chance to decide if you wanted it to. Because that's exactly what this was, not something I planned. Not something I chose consciously, but something I had allowed through every small moment I didn't push away, through every feeling I didn't deny. Through every second I chose to stay present instead of retreating back into the emptiness I had accepted for so long, and now, there was no pretending this was small anymore, no convincing myself that it didn't matter, no returning to the version of my life where nothing felt important, because now, something did, something had already become part of me in a way that couldn't be undone easily. And that realization, it brought with it something I hadn't fully faced until that moment, something deeper than curiosity, deeper than awareness, deeper than even attachment. It brought clarity. Because for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I understood something clearly about myself. I was no longer just surviving, I was starting to feel alive again, and that realization, it changes everything. Because when you go from surviving to feeling alive, even in the smallest way, you can't go back to pretending that nothing matters. You can't go back to the silence that once felt normal, because now you've experienced something beyond it. Something that reminds you that there is still more, still something left, still something possible, and that awareness, it's powerful, because it forces you to confront a truth you might not have been ready to admit before. Your life isn't over. Not in the way you believed, not in the way you had accepted, because if it was, you wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be feeling this, you wouldn't be standing at this point where something actually matters again. And that truth, it didn't come with comfort, it came with responsibility, because once you know your life isn't over, you have to decide what to do with what's left of it, and that's not an easy decision. Especially when you've spent so long believing there was nothing left to decide. And as I stood there in that realization, something else became clear too. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about the way his presence had changed how I felt. It was about what that change meant for me, about what it was asking from me, because something like this, it doesn't just happen without asking something in return. It asks you to step forward, to allow it, to stop holding yourself back from something that might actually matter. And that's where the real turning point was, not in anything he did, not in anything that happened externally. But in the moment, I realized that this wasn't about waiting to see what would happen anymore. It was about deciding whether I would let it become something more. And that decision, it carried weight. Because it meant stepping out of the safety I had built, the certainty of emptiness, the control of expecting nothing, and into something uncertain, something that could change everything in ways I couldn't predict. And that uncertainty, it's not easy to embrace because it comes with risk, with vulnerability, with the possibility that things might not turn out the way you hope. And for someone who had already lost so much, that risk felt real. It felt heavy, it felt like something I wasn't sure I was ready to face again. And yet, despite all of that, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, despite the possibility of loss, there was something stronger than all of it. something that refused to be ignored, something that made every doubt feel smaller in comparison. I didn't want to go back to who I was before, and that realization, it's everything. Because the moment you know you don't want to go back is the moment you've already chosen to move forward, even if you haven't fully admitted it yet, and as that truth settled inside me. As I allowed myself to stand in it without trying to escape it, I realized something that felt both simple and life changing at the same time. I didn't need certainty to continue, I just needed willingness. Willingness to let this unfold, willingness to see where it leads, willingness to accept that I don't control the outcome, only the decision to keep going, and that realization, it changed everything. Because it shifted the question from what if this doesn't last to something else entirely. What if this is exactly what I needed? And that question, it stayed with me, stronger than anything before it. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just thinking about what I had lost. I was starting to think about what I might still find, and standing there in that quiet but powerful shift, I couldn't ignore one final thought that had begun to take shape. If this has already brought me back to life in ways I never expected, then what could it become if I fully allow it? What if I told you that the most powerful moment isn't when everything changes? It's when you finally accept that it already has, because after everything I had felt, after all those quiet shifts that slowly pulled me out of the life I thought was over, I reached a point where I couldn't deny it anymore. I couldn't pretend this was just a phase, just a passing feeling, just something temporary that would fade like everything else had faded, because maybe you felt that too, that moment where something becomes undeniable, where you realize that what you're experiencing isn't just happening, it's transforming you. And that's exactly where I found myself, not in some dramatic ending, not in some clear resolution, but in a quiet understanding that carried more weight than anything that had come before it. Because now I knew something I hadn't known when all of this began. I wasn't the same person anymore, not the one who believed everything was over, not the one who had accepted a life without meaning, without feeling, without anything to look forward to, because something had changed inside me, something had come back to life, something I didn't even realize I had lost until it returned. And that realization, it's powerful. Because it doesn't just change how you feel in one moment, it changes how you see everything moving forward. Because now I wasn't just looking at my life as something that had ended. I was seeing it as something that still had space for something new, something unexpected, something I hadn't planned but could no longer ignore. And that shift, it changes everything, because when you stop seeing your life as finished, you start allowing it to continue. You start opening yourself to possibilities you had already closed. You start noticing things you had stopped paying attention to, and most importantly, you start feeling again, and feeling, it's what makes everything real. It's what turns moments into meaning. It's what transforms something small into something that can change your entire perspective. And that's exactly what this did, because it wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about a stranger walking into my life at the moment I had lost everything. It was about what that moment awakened in me, what it reminded me of, what it brought back after I had convinced myself it was gone. And once something like that returns, you can't pretend it doesn't matter. You can't push it back into silence, because now you know it exists, now you know what it feels like, and that awareness, it forces a choice. Not about what will happen next, but about who you will be moving forward, because you can either go back to the version of yourself who accepted less, who avoided feeling, who stayed safe in the certainty of nothing changing, or you can step forward into something uncertain, something real, something that has the potential to change everything again. And standing there in that realization, I understood something with complete clarity. I didn't want to go back, not to the life where nothing mattered, not to the version of myself who had stopped expecting anything more, because even with all the uncertainty, even with all the risk, even with the possibility that this might not last, it still felt more real than anything I had experienced in a long time, and that reality, it mattered more than fear, it mattered more than doubt. It mattered more than the comfort of staying the same, and that's when everything became clear, not in a dramatic decision, not in a single moment of action, but in a quiet acceptance that settled inside me. I was going to move forward. I was going to allow this to exist. I was going to let my life continue instead of holding it in the place I thought it had ended. And that acceptance, it didn't erase the past. It didn't change what I had lost. It didn't undo anything that had brought me to this point, but it gave me something I didn't have before: direction, not a clear path, not a guaranteed outcome, but a willingness to see what comes next, and sometimes that's all you need. Not certainty, not answers, just the willingness to take one step forward instead of staying where you are. And as I stood there, no longer holding onto the idea that my life was over, no longer trapped in the silence that had defined everything for so long, I realized something that felt both simple and life-changing at the same time. Losing everything didn't end my story, it just brought me to a moment where something new could begin. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves you with. The one I didn't ask myself until everything had already changed. If you lost everything you thought defined your life, and something unexpected came along to change it, would you be brave enough to believe that it's not the end, but the beginning of something you never saw coming?